Thank you, everybody, for being here. I've got the task of grilling my colleagues on the road to COP30 in Berlin, which is a challenging one, and there's a lot to unpack, and we've only got 20 minutes. I've got lots of questions, but I hope you do too, so please send them in, and we will find time to ask them. Maybe, Will, I will start with you. Can you just set the scene for everyone in terms of what we know so far about the outcomes we might see at COP, and also the elephant in the room, or perhaps not in the room, that is the US and the part that they may play in these proceedings?
Yes, I think that's going to be the focus for everyone, is a COP with the US about to leave Paris for the second time, and US that's actively hostile to the idea of global climate diplomacy, that is hugely skeptical of climate change. That's a pretty challenging backdrop for all the other people who are going to be there. I think one question is how the US will behave, because it takes them a year to leave Paris, so they will still be present and able to attend. And I think one question people will want to answer, and we had our colleague John Ainger at the pre-COP conference in Bonn this week, and I think he picked up that people were nervous about how the US might behave and whether they would become a spoiler. I think that's one question for people. As to what can be achieved, I don't think at this stage people are thinking there's a huge goal. If we think about the last couple of COPs, it was in the UAE to get that language about transitioning away from fossil fuels was the sort of headline goal. Last year it was about the finance target. That hasn't emerged yet, but we got some important things on the way. We're waiting to get everyone's nationally determined contributions, which will be very important in terms of setting the level of climate ambition. And I think that for Brazil, it's a very big diplomatic moment for the country, for President Lula, and he will want it to be ambitious. The one thing that I think a lot of people will be focused on is finance again. That was the big thing at Baku last year, but actually making that happen, getting that 300 billion that was pledged, trying to turn it into 1.2 trillion, that will be a big focus, but we can unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah, actually, I might turn to Natasha on that. I guess an integral part of COP, both the formal negotiations and then the sort of private sector sideline discussions are all around that finance picture. And this is the first COP since we've seen a lot of banks pull out of net zero banking alliances, particularly US and Canadian ones, but not only them. So will they still play a part in these proceedings, and what does that sort of broader climate finance picture look like right now?
Yeah, so we're obviously still a few months out, but what we're hearing so far is that at least the largest banks and investors will have a presence in Brazil. I think there's a question as to whether they'll be in Belém itself. There's an event, or there are events in Sao Paulo the week before. I think there'll definitely be presence of the senior executives there, and perhaps some are sending sort of technocrats to Belém, but whether they'll send big delegations there, I think it's very much still a question. I think everybody's still a bit concerned about the logistics, where people are going to stay, all of this. So I think they will be there. It is interesting. It's, as you said, it's the first COP since America's largest banks and others have left the NZBA, investors as well. So how, and it's been a very hard line to tread this year between US stakeholders and European stakeholders, how you speak to each of those. So it will be interesting to see how that pans out at the event, how they position themselves. On climate finance, it's always a tricky one in terms of the numbers, because the numbers are, they're created with a time lag. So the OECD, which kind of tallies the formal climate finance numbers, did so last year for 2022, found they had hit the 100 billion per year goal for public finance, but 2 years late. We're now, targeting a new goal that was agreed last year in Baku, and we don't have the numbers yet for that. The CPI in the US has calculated that there's around, I think, 196 billion for emerging markets created last year in climate finance, but that relates to the $1.3 trillion goal. So that sort of illustratively for 2023 shows we're still a long way off. And I think if you look at what's happened this year, obviously with Trump pulling overseas, all sorts of overseas finance, gutting US aid, and then in Europe, we're seeing development finance budgets being reallocated to defence. Like, it's obviously not painting a very positive picture for how that might be panning out right now.
Although we have done some interesting reporting on allocations to defence finding their way back into climate, right? So perhaps all is not lost. We will come back to the finance piece, but given we've touched on banking, touched on the US, Will, I wanted to ask you about China, because they will be pretty important to what we see happening in Berlin.
Yeah, I mean, China is always a key player at COP for obvious reasons, and they tend to take a leadership role when it comes to the grouping of emerging nations. But I think it's important to remember that one of the most important drivers at COP, especially at Sharm el-Sheikh, at Dubai, was this bilateral relationship between the US and China, between John Kerry and his counterpart. And obviously, that's not going to happen anymore, and China will, in some senses, be on its own. But the relationship that really matters to China in this COP, because it's a very important relationship to China more broadly, is Brazil. It's a very important economic relationship. Brazil is a key supplier of natural resources, especially food, to China. And I think that for that reason, this may be the first COP in many years that Xi Jinping appears at, which will be very important, I think, to the profile of the COP. He will want to be part of a successful COP. And the Chinese delegation will want to ensure that progress is made. So I think watching China, looking at what they want to achieve, their posture will be very important to understanding how the COP develops and its success or failure.
And a slight change of tack, but given this is a COP in the Amazon, it's being branded as sort of a COP of forests. Natasha, I wanted to ask you specifically on that point. Can you talk a little bit about the action that we may see in terms of support for global forests?
Yeah, so I think the big kind of flagship pitch of proposal that Brazil are bringing into COP30 is this tropical forest finance facility, the TFFF, which is it's been described as an audacious idea. It's interesting in the sense that it's a non-market mechanism for protecting standing forests, which carbon markets have historically failed to do. They prevent deforestation rather than finance those that are already standing. So that's interesting. That it's a $125 billion fund. They're looking to raise $25 billion in kind of cheap funding from government sources and philanthropy. Use that to leverage $100 billion from the markets. Invest that $125 billion into higher yielding emerging market bonds, and use the differential between the cost of borrowing and the higher returns in emerging markets to they're targeting $4 billion a year there, which they've then calculated they can pay each country. There's about 70 countries, tropical forest countries around the world, $4 a hectare to protect their forests. And it doesn't sound like a very big number, but it's a block payment. So if you've got 100 hectares, you'll get $400 per hectare. My math is awful. But it's a block payment, and then there's a big penalty if you fail to comply. So you also get deducted money. So it's interesting whether or not they'll be able to raise 125 billion, which they need to level the 25 to level the 100 this year, or even in years to come in the current climate, is a big question. And there's other questions kind of around how that fund's going to operate. But that's their kind of big pitch that they're coming to the event with.
And how does that relate back to the health of the Amazon and Brazil's own problems, I guess?
Yeah, so I think under Lula, Brazil has succeeded in bringing deforestation down. It's home to, I think, 2/3 of the world's tropical forests. So it's a very important country, obviously, in that sense. But this was sort of reversed somewhat last year, which saw globally tropical and boreal forests saw the worst forest loss on record due to wildfires. And Brazil was responsible for 42% of that, so more than any other country. So last year, the COP host saw the worst loss of forest than anyone else. That was due to wildfires, but also cattle ranching and soy. So they have got a lot of work to do, and there's also a controversial bill that's working its way through the channels around loosening environmental permitting. So that's not coming at a good time either in terms of COP and protection of forests.
Yes, I think just to add to what Natasha said, that Brazil's economy, environmental record is quite interesting. The previous 3, even 4 COPs, if you include the UK, had a lot of controversy because they've been in oil-producing countries, especially the UAE. Dubai took a lot of heat internationally for hosting COP as one of the world's biggest oil producers. Brazil produces more oil than the UAE. It pumps 3.5 million barrels of oil a day. And I don't think that people always understand that about Brazil. Obviously, it's a very different, much bigger, broader economy than UAE, less dependent. But I think this shows the complexity of the situation. And to make the point about deforestation and soy that Natasha just made too, Brazil is by far the world's largest soy producer. The amount of farmland planted for soy has increased by 50% in the last 10 years. Now, that's not all in the rainforest, but it's put enormous pressure on the rainforest, and it's also the second biggest cattle producer, again, putting enormous pressure on the rainforest. So I think, in many ways, a lot of people in the climate community will be excited that it's in Brazil, a more liberal country than some other hosts, but we should see the Brazilian posture in the round. And of course, it speaks to the complexity of the energy transition for every country in the world. But I think it's interesting to look at the scope of the Brazilian economy and the challenges it faces.
And I want to pause there and just remind everyone that you are more than welcome to ask questions. We would love to hear from you. But Will, maybe I'll stay with you. As we head towards November, you've talked about a lot of the sort of key news points that we're watching for. But is there anything else that you'd flag or that you want to go into more detail on?
So obviously, this is a year when everyone has to resubmit their nationally determined contributions, as I mentioned. I think there will be some focus on that. Some people have done it. The UK already announced at Baku a more ambitious NDC, and the current government seems quite committed to trying to stick to climate targets. But obviously, it's a world where the political vibe, if we like, around climate change feels quite different to it did, say, at Glasgow or even Dubai. So I think there will be quite a lot of focus on how those NDCs and how countries maintain their ambition. And two that we want to look at, particularly, I think, because they incorporate a huge slice of global emissions, are China and the European Union. I mean, China has said, and I think people were pleased about this, that the new NDC will be a whole economy NDC. So it won't just be carbon, which was progress, but I think they will have to lay down targets for 2035, and there will be a lot of focus on how ambitious those are. And the same goes for the EU, which of course has very ambitious carbon targets. The new Commission, I think, is going to be able to craft a deal that sticks to them. But again, 2035, Europe has to do a 55% reduction in carbon from 1990 levels by 2030. How much faster will it go by 2035? I think a lot of people will be watching that to get a picture of global ambition. And those numbers will go into some work that we've done around COP about where we are in terms of, if we stick to those NDCs, how much global warming do we get? The other country to watch, I think, that's quite important is India, of course, another enormous emitter. And I think there's some worry in the climate diplomacy community that because of the wider environment, because of Trump, because of Modi's economic imperatives, that India isn't really engaging and not showing much ambition. So I think that's something that people will be watching as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And some of our colleagues actually had a story today on, to your point, around Europe, talking about the European Commission's aim to get a 2040 target out next week, but some pushback that's happening on that. So you're right, it's a very active space. Natasha, you're our sustainable finance expert. What trends are you watching as we head towards November?
I think one big area, again, in Brazil will be nature. Debt for nature swaps, these deals where countries refinance their debts and using concessional finance and allocate any savings towards nature conservation. They have been much hyped in previous years. Last year, the market almost doubled in size in the last couple of quarters alone. With interest from the largest banks, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Standard Chartered, they've all done deals there. So I think that's one area that's interesting this year. It's really kind of tapered off. We've seen no deals during the first half of the year. I think everyone's very much in a holding pattern. These deals do rely on money from multilateral development banks and other kind of sources of concessional finance. And obviously, the US International Development Finance Corporation has been a big supporter with political risk insurance. there's big uncertainty there around whether they would still back these kinds of deals that promote climate and nature objectives. Likewise, some of the MDBs in which the US is the largest shareholder. So I think it's in a holding pattern. I think there's a lot of conversation around changing the use of proceeds, so using the same deal structures, but rather than supporting climate or nature projects, maybe allocating money to broader development objectives, although of course that's not hugely palatable to Trump administration either, or energy security, which obviously may well be more palatable. So that's one area we're watching. I think also developments around the carbon market, the Article 6 carbon market, there's not going to be any formal negotiations there, but there's lots of efforts underway to try to revive the voluntary carbon market. I think Brazil's got a very sort of split stance on that. They've hosted a lot of REDD+ projects in the past. They've benefited hugely from the old UN Clean Development Mechanism. But then they've also come to this event with this big TFFF, which is not, it's really an alternative to the carbon markets for forest protection. So I think those are kind of two areas that we'll be tracking.
And Will, do you have any thoughts on that sort of point that Natasha just raised about multilateralism and what that will mean at this COP? Because it's clearly being tested. I think Ambassador Correa de Lago has made comments to that. To that effect.
Clearly it is deeply tested, and it's tested in climate, but of course it's tested in all sorts of ways throughout the world, as we see in this completely frenetic news environment that we're living through at the moment. I think it will mean that those countries which tend to take a leadership role at COP will be very keen to ensure that it's a successful COP, that it doesn't end fractiously, that we can get to an agreement. I think it will be difficult. I mentioned India, but we've seen at recent COPs that there are other countries, Saudi Arabia principally, but also Iran and Russia, and we should always remember it requires consensus to get a deal, which haven't prevented deals happening, but which are keen to assert the interests of fossil fuel producers, are keen to make sure that language is moderated around the energy transition and the transition away from fossil fuels. And I don't think we can expect them to back away from that in the current environment, and given the stance of the United States, even though the United States won't be involved. So it will be tough to maintain that multilateral stance, but they will have the support of China. And I think one thing we can say is that Brazil is a country with a lot of diplomatic clout, with a very strong diplomatic tradition, a big diplomatic network, and perhaps Azerbaijan didn't have that. So I think they have advantages, and they have a lot of goodwill from people, so fingers crossed.